How do Ukrainian women promote our country worldwide? What are the intersections between feminism and your identity, and how we can ensure equality and diversity nowadays? Good evening, everyone, or good day if you're joining us from the other part of the globe and just started your day. My name is Maria Cheretina, and I'm the America House Program Assistant. At America House, Kyiv, we do strive for the protection of human rights, equality, diversity, and inclusivity. And together with the project Divchata, we have this panel discussion with prominent female leaders who have Ukrainian roots and who do their best to develop the image of Ukraine worldwide. So with great pleasure, I'd like to introduce Kateryna Kazimirova, co-founder of the project Divchata, who will moderate today's discussion and will tell you what are the goals of their initiative and will share some more information about the Divchata initiative. So Kateryna, hi, thank you for doing all these preparations for this panel discussion today. And the floor is yours.
Дякую, Marichka. Thank you, Marichka. Good morning to our US audience and good afternoon and evening to our audience globally. Like Marichka said, my name is Kateryna Kazimirova, and first of all, I want to thank you all for joining us today on Veterans Day here in the US. Thank you to all of our veterans and also all of the women and men in Ukraine and the world beyond in the military. I'm one of the founders and co-heads of Divchata. For those of you who haven't come into contact with our group before, welcome. In short, Divchata is a project dedicated to building a diverse community of women rooted in our shared Ukrainian heritage. It's very important to us to have our community be a source of information that inspires. This mission over the last 2 years has manifested itself in many different ways, including book talks, philanthropic events, merchandise even, and then my personal favorite, open discussions and panels like the one today. To that end, a core tenet of ours is fostering discussions and shared learning that spans geographies. During the pandemic, we began exploring different mediums of shared discussion, from Clubhouse to Instagram Live. And really our aspiration was continuing to expand our audience and growing our contributor base and that shared learning over time. So as such, we're incredibly grateful and honored to be able to hold this panel today in partnership with America House Kyiv. So as Marichka mentioned, feminism and its interplay with identity today means so many different things to so many different people. And these definitions and experiences are informed by an almost endless array of factors, from geography to schooling to work experience to family, upbringing, and then also, importantly, heritage. By no means can we touch on all of that in a 1-hour panel, but we want to begin, and we think it's important to begin, scratching the surface of exploring how feminism interplays with the Ukrainian identity specifically. So we're honored to do that today by diving into a few panelists' own experiences and using those to spark our audience's thoughts and then hopefully further discussions. In terms of structure, just to orient our audience, we will have each of our 3 panelists today engaging with a couple of key topics of focus, and then from there, we're excited to open things up further to our audience for some questions and answers. A quick note on language, while all of us are comfortable speaking Ukrainian and are happy to take any questions in Ukrainian from our audience, we're going to be holding the panel today primarily in English. And with that, I'd love to let our panelists introduce themselves. Dora, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, my name is Dora Chomiak. I'm a native New Yorker. Professionally now, I advise organizations on marketing and audience engagement. Simultaneously, I'm a volunteer with Erasmus for Ukraine, where I currently serve as the president of that organization. In 1991, I worked in Ukraine for several years, where I helped co-found various media organizations, including Unyan is one that you might be aware of in this audience. For the purposes of this conversation, things you won't find out about me from the bio or the LinkedIn profile, but I think are relevant to some of the topics we hope to tackle today is I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, and I'm a daughter.
Amazing. Thank you, Dora. Kateryna, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Yes, sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Kateryna. I'm Ukrainian, live in Ukraine, and for now in Kyiv. I've been living for 7 years. I moved here from Donetsk since war started. So then in Donetsk, I was teaching at the university literature and history of art. Since moving here, I work in technology sphere as IT project manager, and I'm a head of development team. We're helping Ukrainian business go online, promote them, so different kind of all businesses. And 1 year ago, my partner and I launched online media interview-based, devoted to prominent Ukrainians and Ukrainian voice all over the world. And it's my side project now, but now it's maybe even main one. As the two absolutely full-time jobs I have all at once. And trying to combine technology sphere with cultural sphere.
Amazing, thank you. And then finally, Ola, would you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Hi, my name is Ola Rondiak. I was born in America as first generation Ukrainian because my parents were immigrants from Ukraine after escaping after World War II. But for the last 25 years, I've been living mostly in Kyiv, Ukraine. I have 3 children, 2 dogs, and 1 husband. Initially, I was a social worker after I got out of college, and then I went on to graduate school and worked as a psychotherapist. And then after I had children, I started creating art. And since then, now my artwork is full-time, my job. My artwork stems from a lot of my family's experiences from living in Ukraine, as well as my family history, all my roots, my ancestors that come from Ukraine, and also intertwined with Ukraine's history and its development of things I've witnessed firsthand over the last 25 years, which has been a lot of changes. My main topics in my artworks are focused on freedom and femininity and identity. The female image looms very large in my work, and the female portrait has kind of become a metaphor for truth and dignity and determination and the strength of women. My Maltanka sculptures are inspired by the ancient Ukrainian ragdoll, which were passed down from mothers to their daughters as a talisman for good health and fortune. And when the war broke out in Ukraine, I started creating the Maltanka sculptures out of plaster of Paris, because plaster is what we use to heal broken bones. So I added this element symbolically for healing and protection for Ukraine. And most recently, I started creating straitjackets, and my journey to creating them have been a culmination of my family history, my past career as a psychotherapist, as well as my family history. And through this process of creating them, I've learned that we must create our own freedom regardless of our own circumstances and outside circumstances. So basically, they symbolize this journey of finding our own freedom within. I flip this jacket and I cut off the sleeves, and then it symbolizes freedom.
Wonderful. That's amazing. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for that introduction. They said it a lot better than I could. As you can see, we have a lot of different experiences between our 3 women, which will make for a really interesting discussion. So with that, we'd love to move into our first topic. Again, we're going to just scratch the surface here between how we talk about these different things. And I'm really excited to hear what these things mean to our different women and kind of how that's been informed by their experiences. But first, very broadly, I'd love if we just talked quickly about what being a Ukrainian woman has meant to each of you sort of throughout your life. Does being a Ukrainian woman uniquely inform or affect your identity as a woman on the whole? And if so, how?
I can dive in. Really eager to hear what people have to say. So I, like Ola, was born here in the United States to parents who were both born in what's now Ukraine and came here as displaced person. So I grew up being Ukrainian was just always a part of who I was. I grew up in a house with 3 generations, which was not common for the Washington, D.C. suburb where I grew up. I grew up with a feminist father and an inadvertently feminist grandfather, all in one house, speaking Ukrainian. And I learned English from television shows and going to school. So it was always a bilingual household. I wasn't allowed to see Ukraine. I didn't get a visa to go to Ukraine until I was already in college. And that's when I met my broader family there. So it's hard. I do want to just wrap this section by saying that, so I've always I had a connection to Ukraine. And I had the good fortune of being able to go there at a very critical time of change for the country and for myself, just as a 18, 19-year-old person. But so I was always Ukrainian, I had a Ukrainian thing, and I always had an American thing. And they were in conflict, but it wasn't they were never in conflict. There was a tension, but it wasn't a destructive kind of conflict. So I'm curious to hear what other people in this conversation, what their experiences have been in terms of identifying themselves. But those are things I wanted to share. 3 generations and kind of a constructive tension.
I guess maybe it's appropriate for me to chime in since it's so similar. I also, same as Dora growing up, I did not have 3 generations in my house all the time, but in the summers I did. And similar story, our parents went through displaced persons camp, and my mother was in Austria for 4 years on her road, on her path here. After leaving Western Ukraine, I guess I'll briefly just tell my mother's story as quickly as I can. Was after the war, or during the war, my grandfather had already been in prison with the Soviets because he was a patriot and he taught Ukrainian in Ukrainian schools. And so when the front was moving further and further west, they got word that they need to leave. My grandmother stayed in their house because my aunt, her 19-year-old daughter, was very ill. So she told my grandfather to take my mom, who was only 11 at the time, basically for protection for him so that they don't shoot him. And they, of course, were hoping that they would return back to their home in Western Ukraine. But unfortunately, the front kept moving west. They ended up walking, through Hungary, through Slovakia, ended up in Austria, where they were with displaced people for 4 years. And then they ended up in America, and unfortunately never saw my grandmother again. My mother never saw her mother from age 11 because they sent my grandmother to Mordovia, to a female labor camp. She was there for about 10 years. After she got released, another 5 or 10 years later, they did end up being able to communicate through letters. But this, for me, was a very, I almost didn't realize it till I was older, how strong of an impact that was for me to understand my mother's journey without her mother, and my grandmother's story of being alone in this female labor camp, and how influential her strength was to me, even though I had never met her, because while she was there, after doing physical labor all day and having lost everything, her family and her home, she still secretly created embroideries at night. And then she smuggled them out, and when she got back to Western Ukraine, she handed them to a priest who was traveling to America in the hope that these embroideries would reach her family somehow, even though she had no idea where they were. This priest got to Chicago. He smuggled these embroideries in. The Chicago Tribune in 1980 wrote an article about these embroideries from Soviet prisons with love. And eventually, through the diaspora, they found out it was my family in Ohio, and they got most of the embroideries. So this was basically, I guess, the backbone of my understanding of what it meant to be a woman, and how strong the strength that we carry within. So basically, I feel like I've gotten my strength from so much of my grandmother's life story, because even though I never met her and she had such an impact on me, I'm blown away by her strength, her ability to have hope when she lost everything.
Very, very powerful. Yeah, and even a lot of the things that you said, it's funny how many of us share similar stories, at least in the diaspora Ukrainian Americans. My family also traveled through Austria after they left Ukraine to come to the US. And growing up, I'm sure a lot of Ukrainian Americans also went to Ukrainian school and heard a lot of these stories and just these anecdotes about these strong Ukrainian women.
Yeah.
Dora, I know you also have a lot to say about that, so maybe we get into it as we move on. But Kateryna, I'd love to hear from you how you orient around this concept of Ukrainian female identity.
Since we're talking about our families, I'm also lucky to be surrounded all my life by a really strong woman. My grandma, two of my great grandmas, yes, it's called. So my grandma was a teacher, school teacher, but really respectful, and she was kind of power source, like a moral authority for all our family and our even neighborhood. Our apartment, our place, always been like a safe place for everyone. Every single woman can just go to us and ask for any help, for any support. It was like early 90s in Donetsk, tough times it was, and something was going on all the time. Some women who were struggling with their alcoholic husband or something like that, and my grandma had such a power, such an energy to stop any conflict, to stop any difficult situation and protect people who really needed that. And she also had really dramatic story. After the war, she lost her mom in an early age. Then her father left family, just found someone else who is younger. And she just stayed with two brothers, and one of them was really ill. But through all her life, she remained really strong, cheerful, and never lost belief in humanity and helped others. And interesting story about my great grandmother's sisters, and really they lived for a long time. One of them was born in 1912 and lived long life. Had 4 husbands, no kids, not at the same time 4 husbands, but all her lifetime, and was really independent. And I was lucky to be connected with all the generation of different women in my family. And she always taught me to be also independent, to find my own way, not to listen to others, but listen to myself. But at the same time, she had her sister, absolutely traditional, exemplary housewife with the kids, with one man all life, never worked, I guess. Yes, I remember she never worked. But they were absolutely best friends ever, supported each other choices, never arguing, and really supported each other. So for me, it's actually, it means this feminist values when you can choose your own way, but remain respectful for others' choices.
Yeah, that's very interesting, kind of as we start thinking about the word feminism and how different it looks in different places and what that means. And that was actually a perfect sort of first foray into diving into that concept and what feminism has meant to each of you and sort of how you've interacted with the concept. Has that changed? What does it mean to you today? I'd love to kind of chat about that more, because I think that as we just take these little slices and think about how that interaction is informed by each of your experiences, it'll be pretty fascinating for our audience to hear about and understand better. Whoever wants to dive in.
I'll dive in. I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because we're really shining a light on topics that are just beginning. I mean, you're saying scratching the surface, but we're just beginning to explore them. And so if we take feminism as a word, for me, has been with me as long as I can remember. And I think it's a term that has changed over time. So it's important to root it into a time and a place. So I came of age in the 1980s when and for me, the external view of feminism was negative. It was the 1980s. It was women trying to be like men. It was this extreme going to throw some stereotypes out here, ugly man haters. At the same time, and here I'm going to put in a plug here for a book. At the same time, as I was coming of age, my mom, who is a historian, was working on original research that turned into a book, Feminists Despite Themselves, which
Amazing.
is really a history of Ukraine, but told not through the dominant political structures, but it's told through community organizations. So it's a history of Ukraine in a time period when Ukraine was a non-sovereign state. And so here I am, for me, feminism, she called it Feminists Despite Themselves. She introduces this idea of pragmatic feminism. The Ukrainian translation of this book is called Bilim po Bilimu, which Ola refers, as you know, to a type of embroidery where it's white thread on white fabric and you don't see it. And this is all tied for me with the word feminism, because I was living in this 3-generation, very feminist household, wearing my T-shirt that said a woman's place is in the house and the Senate, where house was capital H. I have the buttons of, feminism is the radical idea that women are people too. This is the 1980s, this 1980s United States. So now I think the term has gotten cool again in a good way. It is still a change, and I'm not going to lie, Kristen, when Divchata was coming together, I struggled with the word Divchata, because from where my rooting is girls isn't something that is a positive. But again, yeah. I've come around. And so yeah. I think feminism too, and the notion of feminism has really changed, and I'm glad where it's changed. And I'm proud to be raising 2 feminist daughters with my feminist husband. And I think the more we use the word, the more meaningful it becomes. Again, I think because it's in this pragmatism, in like who does the housework, quite literally, who provides the food and the shelter, and how that is provided, and doing that regardless of gender is I think where we're going to as a society and as a community. So those are just some of the themes I wanted to put out there, and I'm eager to hear how other people interact with the term feminism as a practice versus an ideology.
Yeah. I mean, just briefly, even with the name Divchata, it was very specific and very mindfully that we chose that name, because kind of, as Dora mentioned, some of these things over time, when you say feminism or you say XYZ, it evokes a very strong either good or bad reaction from people. And for us, it was just important to sort of interact with the concept of, girls and women, and using that name, and just what does that mean, and how can we reclaim that and rally around it and think about it, and what does it mean in different places. So if anyone else has more thoughts on feminism and their understanding of it and how it's changed over time, would love to kind of hear that.
I just wanted to say I agree with Dora that I was going to say the similar thing, that I mean, like the basis of feminism for me was always believing in, advocating for women's rights, basically, for equality, on the basis of equality of the sexes. And, I remember my mother saying when I was a kid that my grandfather is a feminist, and it had such a positive connotation just for upholding, and supporting women. And also, like, I guess when the women's lib movement and everything sort of, I guess when there's a movement, typically it tends to go very extreme initially, and then it sort of comes back to, the main purpose of it. And I guess in that extremity, sometimes things get misinterpreted, or like Dora was saying, where it's sort of, some people were defining it almost as hating men, or, to this extreme. So I think that it's true that now it's starting to come back to its initial sort of just basic general support of women and advocating for equality. And I also think it's interesting, like, as the women's lib movement and everything, and all this talk about, getting women out of the house and and to work. It's funny because I saw my mother sort of as the stereotypical woman who was a homemaker and devoted her life to raising her children in her home. And so I did sort of see that as the role, but also I was growing up in America, and I felt perfectly free to think about what my career was and didn't feel trapped or by that in any way. And then when I would bring up like, well, that's old fashioned, and so we're going to move into contemporary definition of women, my mother would always say like, but there was no problem, you know, that she remembered between, say, like her parents. She didn't feel like there was sexism or, you know, so it's interesting to me that the time line, like how sexism is viewed, and because we often, you know, I guess define it by being old-fashioned and times are changing, but I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think this opens up the conversation into a very interesting, I don't know, just interesting perspectives, like, because if a woman should choose to stay home and raise her kids and not work outside of the home, does that mean she's not being a feminist, or would you have to? I remember getting into some arguments with this also, like in my 20s with some friends. And actually, if my husband's listening, he knows exactly what I was going to say, because we ended up getting kicked out of somebody's house because I brought up the conversation she was having was basically that I have to get a second job because we have to have a second car and we have to do all these things. And she was all stressed out because she didn't know how she was going to raise her kids. And I just kind of said, look, I mean, the great thing about our generation is that we have a choice. So you don't have to have two cars if you would rather stay home. And she got so angry with me and kicked me out of the house. So I think it's very interesting conversation.
As long as you're having the dialogue. It's too bad you got kicked out, though. That could be a conversation.
The dialogue is important, exactly.
Kateryna, anything you'd want to add before we kind of
just
double
like a
click?
summary for me, it means, because in Ukraine situation, I think still is a little bit different and different understanding how diverse our society is, and different kind of understanding feminism exists. And someone, interesting what I noticed, someone has this feminist values, but prefer not to call that feminism. It's really interesting when I started conversation with some girl, and I remember she said, "I am not feminist, but," and then like all manifesto of feminism. It's interesting. Like, what do you mean? So I'm not insist. You can choose. We're all for freedom of choices, but what do you mean not to saying that it's feminism? And it was really interesting explanation that feminism, it means be active, be an activist. And some people don't want to label themselves with some terms they don't fully accept and don't fully understand, maybe. Or when it links to our like feminine movement, which was on the beginning of all that feminist movement here in earliest 90s. So it's interesting, absolutely different thought on the topic. But for me, of course, the main it's the ability to negotiate your roles and to set your own rules of games, or change already established rules of games. Of course, be respectful for other choices, and relationship based on partnership and mutual respect. And I have a tool how to how to understand what do you think about feminism. Just one question: what do you think about female friendship? If someone replies me it doesn't exist, it means like it's a first sign for sexism. If it exists, so it's on the way to actually feminist values. For example, with my friends, with my best female friends, with one of them we have been friends for 25 years already, the second one for 15 years, and we're absolutely different personalities. We do absolutely different stuff in our life, but on the core core values, of course, are the same. So the ability to be a real friend, for me, it's also connected with the values of feminism.
Which
Yeah.
makes sense because it's individual human rights, right? You can
Yeah.
see a person. And it's where we get into the ideologies and the isms, I think, where things often get messy. And Kateryna, it's fascinating to hear. I do agree with you in Ukraine right now. I'm so glad this conversation is happening, because something that's seared in my memory is sort of the result of Soviet ideology on women, on perception of women and men, because there was equality. Damn it.
Yeah.
and there really wasn't. And just one little anecdote that struck me: when I was working in Ukraine in March of 92, it was the first time I was in Ukraine on International Women's Day, which I did not know was a thing. So here I am, whatever, 21 years old, learning that this is a thing. And at the time in Kyiv, there were fewer cars, and that day was a day off. And I remember that day because I visited several different homes where, Kateryna, you reminded me of your family, your grandparents, of your grandmother, I think it was, who sort of, how do you deal with alcoholism or alcohol abuse? And so 8th of March for me was two things. One, every house we went to, the guys had given flowers and then spent the rest of the day drinking, and the women did all the cleaning up. And the first thing that stays in my, and I was like, really, that's how we're celebrating equality of women? And so we got some work to do here at the sort of Soviet ideology. But it was also the first day that I was given the keys to a car and was able to drive in Kyiv. At the time, I worked for the Soros Foundation. They had two cars. One of them was a stick shift Mazda, and I drove stick shift, and I had got my driver's license when I was 16. And the drivers in the foundation let me drive around Kyiv, which was fun because I hadn't been driving. And I was stopped so many times by the police because they had never, or they had, most of them had never seen a woman behind the wheel before. And that was 1992 on International Women's Day. And so that, to me, Kateryna, is like, yeah, that ideology of simultaneously we are equal and yet we are not respected, right? We don't respect each other's contribution to society. But this facade of everything's fine, everything's great, really needs to be dismantled over a few generations to recognize the core. And I think the best way to do it, and the fastest way to do it, is just the core human rights of like cleaning the house, getting food into the house is valued. Doing other work is also valued, and let's respect each other and what we contribute, and not try to go into these, like in the 80s, all the women had to wear little bow ties and pantyhose and men's suits and try and look like guys. You know, be women, be who you are. You're not a man. You are a woman, and respect what you contribute as having power and value as well. So,
yeah, that's very, very interesting, especially kind of as you give that anecdote of the almost cognitive dissonance between International Women's Day and how constricted you really were, and then broadly how those things look in practice. I think as we think about how Ukrainians, whether it's in Ukraine in a moment in time or today or in the past, or Ukrainian Americans in the diaspora have interacted with feminism, that also brings to bear a couple of interesting thoughts and perhaps tensions between, because I remember when I was growing up, I'm sure a lot of Ukrainian Americans have had this experience where you're in Saturday school, you're in history class, and you're learning about all these different things, and you're learning about people like Kyiv, Olha, or just these women in Ukrainian history that were very strong figures. But what do we define as strength? How was that not in tension with perhaps some of the more quote unquote traditional Ukrainian ideals of a woman in the home? How do these things coexist? Kind of exactly like Dora was talking about, how did these strong women come to be, but without sort of the label of the ideology, and what does that look like? So I think all of these ideas are in tension, but yet in concert with each other. And it's almost uniquely Ukrainian in a way. It's very interesting to think about these strong women in history who have at once embodied the more traditional values and been pillars of the community, but at the same time also done so much more, whether it's through literature, poetry, whatever,
particularly because Ukraine was non-sovereign, was a non-sovereign state for so long. People in Ukraine didn't have a say in how things were run. So, marketing plug, read this book. But that is why Ukraine gives this lens and that other countries don't have. Because if you try and study Ukraine only through traditional organs of the state, you can get somewhere. But you have this opportunity to say, well, what were community organizations doing under a Soviet state? At the same time, what were community organizations doing under a Polish state? What were community organizations, in all these different times in the United States, and that for that matter, what are these community organizations doing, and where are the similarities, and where are the differences? And that brings to light stuff that's always been going on. But in between doing the grocery shopping and making dinner and cleaning the dishes, you don't stop and discuss and examine in ways that are perceived to be kind of traditional, like all those books in the background that I've got, like in more structured formats. Like you don't have time to crank out all these books all the time, or have academic conferences that, frankly, most of my professional life has been with white men. And in fact, even now, or, so the rules are not the rules. A lot of the airspace is taken up by that. And so there's a lot of biases and prejudices that we all buy into, and we don't necessarily see them. And I think it's through examining individual stories like we're doing in discussion today that we can start to bring to the forefront some stuff that's invisible otherwise.
Yeah, no, storytelling for that reason is incredibly important. And as we think about how Ukrainians, maybe specifically, again, this will all be slices and all of our speakers' experiences, how Ukrainians interact with the word feminism. What have your experiences been like? I won't drone about mine, but I'd love to kind of hear from all of our panelists in your Ukrainian communities, whether it's in Kyiv or New York or elsewhere. How have you seen Ukrainians interact with the concept of feminism and the female identity?
I can start talking about Ukrainians in Ukraine. So my close circle, it's the same as me. It's obvious, yes, my close people, almost the same as I. But if you go a little bit out from your close circle, it can be even surprising. And I still talk with women, with girls who are really afraid of this concept. And when we're starting to discuss what does it mean to be a feminist, what does it mean, what is values, it's all clear, yes. And they said, like, it's just about human rights. It's not feminist. Why you call it feminist? Why you? It's in their mind. It's all the time in opposition to men, in opposition to just be, I don't know, new man, yes, new type of man, and make man next to you weak. And I always say, like, if some particular man just was waiting for some feminist to come and to become weak, so I had to for all of us, yes. And but it's changing. It's changing as well. As I said, even in one of our latest interview, we had this conversation between our two female writers, and they also raised this topic of feminism in Ukrainian society, and they talk about acceptance. And one of them just said, I'm not against, I'm absolutely into this values, but I just don't call myself feminist again because it means to be an activist, and she doesn't want even just presence that inner activism in herself. With interesting also topics, it's my close friend. She all her life she working is in financial sphere. It all depends actually on sphere when you work and sphere with interact with. I'm also working just mostly in a male sphere and my technical sphere. So she's working in financial sphere. For maybe last 4 years, she's trying to reach that position of chief financial officer. It's like the main position in financial sphere. She has everything for that, all certification, all qualification for that, yes. And it was millions of job interviews, and the in the last interview, just she and maybe two more men. And of course, she never got it. And once even HR, just girl HR told her, like, you're qualified, you're perfect, but we just see men here on this position. But it's not so surprising, and it's obvious here. It's all the time I hear this story. But what surprised me more when we recently discussed all that our professional some issues, and she said me that she was searching for people to join her team because now she works as a chief accountant. It's mostly female job in Ukraine. To be accountant, you need to be female specialist. And she just told she's going to hire just guys on that position. And like, what? Why? Because you're struggling all the time with that all your life. Why don't you want support girls in that position and just to give them a chance? And no, she doesn't want because she's fighting all the time herself. She's on this position like being man, and she doesn't want to use that opportunity to other girls.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, kind of how feminism and women and female empowerment kind of manifests in the workplace. And it's interesting to hear about that experience specifically. Ola, any last comments on this?
Again, I think it's very interesting how the word itself is really such a trigger point, and everyone's trying to understand what it even means, because it seems like it used to be such a positive word to say I'm a feminist, and to say wonderful, it's a supportive word, and it's sort of transferred into like a very negative connotation where it's like, it almost to some people feels like, I think that it's taking away their womanhood, because it means I'm trying to be like a man, and I don't want to be a feminist because I want to appreciate all that femininity has to offer. So it got, I think,
Which
is very
great, by the way.
confusing.
Femininity is awesome.
Yeah, it got to be a confusing word, I think. Like femininity is okay, but feminism somehow became a very confusing word. And I don't know, there was, I guess I'll tell a brief little story. I think when I got married in the 90s and we were moving to Ukraine right away, I remember thinking, oh my God, I'm so Americanized. Like, I don't know how to make borscht yet. So, and I'm getting married and moving to Ukraine. Like, what am I going to do? So, and this was still at the airport. The security was not there at the airports yet. So my mother was literally with me at the gate. While I'm getting on the plane, I was writing down the recipe for borscht she was telling me. And then when I arrived to Ukraine, to Kyiv, my cousin lived in Kyiv. And as soon as we met, I said, oh my God, Oksana, I'm so glad to meet you. We're similar age. I said, you have to teach me how to make borscht. I just got married. She's like, I don't know how to make borscht. I work outside of home all day long, and I'm raising 2 kids. My mama makes borscht, So I thought that was interesting, because somehow in my stereotypical brain of going to Ukraine, every woman my age would know how to make borscht at 25 or 27, And so, and then I thought, oh, that's interesting. She's just like Americans,
Yeah. No, that's incredibly interesting. And I think a couple things that have stood out to me as we're discussing is, one, this concept of how important language and actual words are in terms of evoking different feelings and how that changes where you are, and also intersectionalism. So, what does it mean to a Ukrainian woman to be a feminist and to be a woman? And I mean, we're only scratching the surface of any of that, because as feminism and femininity interplays with different identities, and we kind of get into the issues women face the world over, it just, all of this compounds upon itself and is incredibly nuanced. And I guess, sort of before we open it up to a couple of questions that our audience has started to breach, I'd love to hear from our panelists, because really this is a key tenet of Divchata, is how can Ukrainian women around the world learn from each other, whether it's something like Ola expecting, every woman in Ukraine to know how to make borscht, but in reality that not really being the case, or whether it's us in the US sometimes very egotistically thinking we have things all figured out and we're really so ahead in XYZ, but perhaps we're really not, and we can learn so much more from women in Ukraine or women in Europe or women wherever, and we can maybe learn it even better because we're all Ukrainian. How can we learn from each other?
And that's the superpower. I mean, the superpower of being able to be simultaneously have a Ukrainian component and an American component, for me, is the superpower of this unlocks access to a global community. And I mean, look what we're doing today, right? I mean, Kateryna, I wouldn't have met you otherwise. And I have a million questions about your professional life and your choices with craft, the craft online project and so forth. But it's like being able, my kids who are going through their college applications right now are recently talking about this too. And they've come to realize this super secret great thing about having roots in Ukraine is that you can drop into anywhere on this planet and have a place to stay. Because somebody knows somebody who's somehow connected to Ukraine, and they will open up their door and they will give you a place to sleep, and they might even give you a bowl of borscht if they know how to make it.
Oh, it's so true. I think it is a superpower, and I love that you're having, that we're having this conversation. And I mean, look at how we started the conversation. It was so powerful about our ancestors, about, even though maybe they did work outside of the home, or probably not, but their strength that emanated from us and helped us become strong women and discovering ourselves and our gifts and the best way that we can give to the world. And so for me, I think that's one of the main things I want to share in my artwork also, is this, because I think I intuitively ended up tapping into our ancestry, and especially through my grandmother's story, and not even having met her. But I think this tapping into our ancestors and the ability for us as Ukrainians, it's much more accessible, I feel like, than like my friends that grew up in America. A lot of them didn't really even know what their roots were. And although it was strange for me because I wouldn't see them all summer, I didn't see them on the weekends because I was busy with my Ukrainian plus camps. It was like two different lives. But how it became so I guess rich and diverse, and our cultural heritage and our roots have so much to offer us. And I really want to be a strong advocate for not forgetting about your roots, and hearing those stories and learning from them, because our ancestors have so much to teach us. We have a tendency of sometimes, like you mentioned earlier, of thinking that we're ahead of the game and everything else was old fashioned and they didn't know. It's not true. We have to be sure that we don't forget all the wisdom that they had learned and passed down to us, and what's worth holding on to. We have to be careful not to lose that strength.
Yeah. Kateryna, anything you'd add before we open it up to Q&A?
I have nothing to add to that. Just let's communicate more. Like here, from my perspective, from Ukraine, we need to communicate with the world and to get know more and more. Because yes, in isolation, when we just communicate inside our country with themselves, of course, some radical stuff will be on the first place. But in education, communication, building that networks with all Ukrainians, and not just Ukrainians, with people around the world. What we can actually doing with the craft, with my craft magazine project. Also, we actually launched it with also girl together partners, which is female partners, which also was, sometimes with a smile. People talk about that when I'm talking. I'm with my partner, and we are doing that project. And when they found out it's a female partner, that what kind of partner do you mean? So it's even in our mind to have a partner in a business, female, it's something strange. But even if it's a brand, it's also strange. So yes, we are trying to do that network. Ukrainians all over the world. We started with Paris. We recorded some interviews with our artists in Paris. and writers who live in Paris. Now we will be doing interview in States also. So we're trying to cover all planet with our materials, with our interviews, with our questions. So yes, rising questions and receiving answers so that we are stay connected.
That's terrific because Ukraine has so much to contribute to the world as a whole. And this is what animates my work with Erasm, because unlocking that potential and getting the voices like yours and the ones that you're amplifying, Ukraine has had such a past, Ola, to your point too, that certain muscles are developed that the rest of the world needs right now, needs to be good in using these muscles. And if Ukraine can contribute, hey, look, this is how we trained up these muscles and this is how they work well, then the whole planet will stand to benefit. That's, I think, really exciting about Ukraine right now, is how much how much from Ukraine can be contributed to the world.
Yeah. And hopefully in our own little way, we're contributing to that dialogue today by sharing our own stories. And I guess with that, we can use the last 5 or 10 minutes of our time together to sort of get at a few of the questions that our audience has posed to us. So the first one is about a concept, internalized misogyny. So one of our audience members would love to hear kind of about how each of the panelists think through that. And I guess it's interesting because this is a concept that at least I feel like I didn't necessarily interact with and really think about until college and maybe beyond. I grew up going to an all-girls school, grew up with a feminist dad, grew up not even, I mean, this is a very, of course, incredibly privileged thing to say, but I didn't even think about this concept of internalized misogyny and how my view might be affected by these societal pressures or ideals that are being pushed onto us. So I don't know. And as I've come to think about that more in my adult life and really examined, okay, why do I think that, you know, in order for me to be a successful woman, I should be doing X, Y, Z? Is that something that I came to on my own? Or is that something that is out here being pushed by our broadly patriarchal society? And is that why I'm thinking that? Or, okay, is my reaction to the word Divchata and thinking, oh, that's a little diminutive or silly, is that me? Or is that some kind of internalized concept that I've come to bear? Not that that's what happened to you, Dora, but it's something that we all talked about as we were thinking about this, like why, or even, oh, feminists, that's XYZ and it's so radical, like, or all women are the same, all women are exploring this idea of feminism ideally, or in the same way, in this hysterical way. Like, where are these crazy ideas coming from? And how do we unpack those and interact with them and make sure that we're really coming to things on our own? I'd love to hear how others have sort of thought about that.
I don't think we can come to things on our own. But,
yeah, that's fair.
But it's sort of, we as a society agree on what things are, and by unpacking them, very much so, because I mean, the internalized misogyny to me is something as simple as kind of where you were going in terms of what does success look like? Do I need to get that next title at work? Is that more valuable than making sure I, my children, my husband, and anyone who knocks on my door who I know gets protein, starch, and vegetable every day, right? I mean, you know,
I'm failing on that.
I mean, yeah, right. But it's like, why in the 80s, I can tell you exactly why in the 80s, especially if you go back and watch 80s films, which I've started to do. Oh my God. Sort of what success looks like. But then, but we as humans, like, you know, this is a sort of, after industrialization, we kind of adopted a bunch of stuff, and which we're just now, I think, beginning to question more and more of, like, what is valuable. Now there's talk about measuring happiness, right? And which is a lot more work, like, what is happiness? What is serenity? What is a more holistic view of what success looks like? And so I think that's where internalized misogyny comes in. But I'm not gonna lie, I've got it. I got a lot of it.
Yeah. No, and I think a lot of what this comes down to is understanding and making sure that you're not having blockers up in terms of your choice and what that means. And to me, I mean, honestly, it gets back to, at least, again, this is just my personal view of what feminism means. And it means that no woman, and that spans across women of all races, all sexual orientation, all religions, every kind of identity. No woman or someone who identifies as a woman is being held back from making their own choice, free and clear, or as free and clear as you possibly can get.
It's hard. It's an ongoing thing. It's you never cross the finish line.
I think that's exactly it right there. I mean, it's that freedom to choose, because, you know, when we speak of women, we have to remember that there are a lot of different personalities in every woman. Like, I mean, we're all, you know, we're similar in so many ways, but also different in so many ways. So it's really just about that freedom and the internalized misogyny. It's like, yeah, I think it's an interesting question that we have to individually ask ourselves when we come across that thought. Like, is it, or do I just really prefer to do this and that's okay? You know, because we're so programmed to think, that's sexism, that's wrong. Why am I making you a sandwich? Why don't you make me a sandwich? And it's like, well, that's okay.
It's a sandwich.
It's a sandwich, and what if I'm just better at it? I prefer to do it, or I do it 10 times faster, and that's okay. And maybe I enjoy doing that, and do I actually get pleasure from it? You know, maybe I get pleasure from it. You know, so it's a lot of things I think that we need to ask ourselves individually to check on that, because there's been, a lot of confusion about that. And I think it's important. It's important to think about it and make those personal internal checks.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
And then enjoy ourselves. Yes, most important all the time. And it's what I really think, or it's my society expectation, and some result of my upbringing tells me that, not me. So
it's kind of interesting that I've come to realize that it sort of flips both ways. And I think that's what a lot of us are sort of getting at, is that I sort of used to think of internalized misogyny as the gut reaction to feminism, saying, oh, well, I'm not a feminist. Like, to me, whenever I heard that I was like, internalized misogyny. But it also flips the other way, of someone automatically saying, oh, well, I could never stay at home, I could never do this. And how is that internalized misogyny as well? It's interesting because it really manifests in a lot of different ways. And maybe that brings us in a way to our last question from the audience before we wrap for today, which is, what helps you one of our audience members said, what helps you in this crazy world not lose your identity? And I would push that a little bit to also thinking about how do you reevaluate or think about your changing identity over time, and how do you sort of stay in tune with that? Big question, right? I don't know how I would answer. So.
One more hour to discuss.
Seriously.
I think for me, it's partially making sure I get time alone, some space to think about my days, and make sure I think about the big rocks so I don't get lost in the little ones. And definitely through, focusing on raising my children and what's best for them, it helps me also reevaluate my core values continuously and what I want to pass down to them. And I'm also lucky that in my work, it helps me to do that. I get to delve deeper into, I guess, what's important to me and what I'm projecting out. And also, just when I'm working, I do a lot of just kind of, what's the word I want to say? Like intuitively. I work a lot intuitively, so I kind of end up by default learning about myself through my work.
I think creating space, Ola, as you say, and having conversations like this, and consuming art, consuming culture, reading books, looking at visual arts, seeing performing arts, interacting with sculpture, walking through architecture and landscape in a mindful way. I mean, the role of culture, the role of words and music and sound and all at once is incredibly important, especially
been a little underappreciated, I think.
Yeah, that's why I'm calling it out, because it really matters.
For sure.
Absolutely agree. For culture, yes, and leave some place for creativity in your life. Everyone needs creativity, and women especially, we need that in any case. Even me doing website is also my creative realization.
It's creation.
Yes, of course. reading before sleep, at least 3 pages of fiction, better fiction, not fiction. And for me,
if you want to sleep.
and for me, horseback riding, communication with horses. It's also
Nice.
absolutely different connection. When I feel empty and exhausted, just 1 hour spending with animals helps me. So my personal tool.
Amazing. And at the risk of being incredibly cheesy, I would say that what helps me with identity is things like this, learning from so many amazing women and hearing their stories and one sliver of it, and sort of these kinds of conversations where we really dive to the meat of a lot of things that sometimes we don't take stock and think of every day, and how our experiences and the stories of a few others can really help us go day to day, and what I can learn from those around me. So with that, I just want to thank all of our wonderful panelists today for joining us and just contributing to this dialogue in our own unique sliver of it as Ukrainian women. Although that looks different, we're coming from this at different places, different geographies, different ages, different career paths. This has been incredible, and we can't thank you enough. And thank you to America House Kyiv as well for hosting us today, and to our audience.
Thank you so much.
Of course, and I will speak with all of you very soon. But goodbye to our audience for now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.